Order, please. Before we start the daily routine today, I would like to make an introduction in the Speaker's Gallery today. From Cape Breton, we have the Mayor and councillors up today visiting all the caucuses here in Halifax. So as I introduce you, I'd ask you to stand and we'll applause at the end of the introduction. So in my gallery, from the CBRM, Cape Breton Regional Municipality, Mayor Cecil Clark, Deputy Mayor Kevin Sacre, Councillor Claire Dethridge, Councillor May Rowe, Councillor Darren Bushwagger, Councillor Jim McLeod, Councillor Lowell Cormier, Councillor Charlie Keegan, Councillor Ivan Doncaster, Councillor Eldon McDonald, Wayne McDonald, Director Engineering and Public Works, and I don't see your communications, and Mayor's Office staff, Mark Betton. There we are. I'd like to have a warm welcome here today. We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now read the subject matter for late debate as submitted by the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville. Therefore, be it resolved that the government should be congratulated on successfully achieving its back-to-balance targets and delivered a balanced budget for Nova Scotians, submitted by the Honourable Member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. Presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I beg leave, Mr. Speaker, before making my statement, to make an introduction.
Oh, certainly.
Thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Penny Milton, who is with us in the gallery today. Penny, if you could stand. Ms. Milton is one of the 2 experts the province has named to review the approach of the Halifax Regional School Board and associated agencies to the events that led to the recent tragic death of a student. And I'm pleased that Ms. Milton is able to be with us here today and that this important work is underway. So I would encourage my colleagues to give her a warm welcome to Nova Scotia.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today about an issue that has touched every member in this House and affects everyone we represent in our constituencies. A lot of the discussion is focused on cyberbullying and technology, which are changing the world around us at a rapid pace. But technology is only a tool. The reason that technology tools are used to cause hurt and harm link to broader issues around sexual violence, issues that have evolved over generations and are not unique to Nova Scotia. They require a collective, continuing effort, and I appreciate the cooperation and support of every member of this House. I am asking all members today, government and opposition alike, to join my commitment to do whatever I can to better protect young girls and all victims of violence and bullying. Yesterday, the Premier and the Parsons family were in Ottawa meeting with the Prime Minister. I'm told those meetings went very well. It is clear that the Prime Minister sees this issue very much the same way we do, and he understands the concerns that we have about the gaps that exist in the criminal code. The Prime Minister has told the Premier that the federal government intends to move forward with legislation that would address the kinds of concerns that we and so many Nova Scotians have. I'm encouraged by the Prime Minister's willingness to work together to lower the risk that any family ever has to go through something like this again. Mr. Speaker, Rataya's story is not an easy one to listen to. But what society has to come to terms with is that the alleged activities that gave rise to this tragedy could be criminal activities, and that they need to be considered. Today, our Minister of Justice is there with his federal counterpart, continuing our push for changes to the criminal code that would make the distribution of intimate images without consent a crime. And Mr. Speaker, our government will soon introduce legislation to ensure women, girls, and all Nova Scotians are better protected against bullying and cyberbullying. Today, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to tell the honourable members that the independent review of the response by the Halifax Regional School Board, IWK, Capital Health, and associated agencies to this tragic event is underway. This review will take a close look at what's missing and what changes are needed. I rose last week to announce that the two national experts, Deborah Pepler and Penny Milton, were chosen for this work. Both have tremendous experience and expertise to share, and I am pleased Ms. Milton is in the province today to get this important work underway. I look forward to the interim report by May 10th and a final report by June 14th. Mr. Speaker, much more work is underway, but I also do not want to lose sight of the tremendous work going on already around the province. We will also continue to heed good advice from women's groups, community groups, young people, and people like Wayne McKay and the task force members. They spent countless hours talking and thinking about this issue, and we will continue to benefit from and act on their advice. To quote Mr. McKay, bullying is a major social issue throughout the world and is one of the symptoms of a deeper problem in our society, the deterioration of respectful and responsible human relations. End of quote. Nova Scotia is not alone in the need to respond to this tremendous challenge, but I'm inspired by the countless groups and individual Nova Scotians who have reached out by email, correspondence, and phone, or who stop me in the street to say, "What can I do?" This collective energy and will, Mr. Speaker, presents an opportunity to do things differently, to make a real difference, and to better protect girls, women, and all Nova Scotians against bullying, cyberbullying, and all forms of violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the Minister for sending remarks to this office and for the most recent edits just before presentation. Appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, we did respond to a very similar statement by Minister in this House on April the 11th. And at that time, the official opposition leader and members of this Liberal caucus pledged our full support to the Minister in her efforts to move this file forward. At that time, it was acknowledged that the previous ministers who had been leads on this file, i.e. Education and Justice, had had this file transferred to the minister responsible for the status of women, and we as a caucus welcomed that. The minister has stated, however, in her statement today that, quote, "Our government will soon introduce legislation to ensure women, girls, and all Nova Scotians are better protected against bullying and cyberbullying." And this caucus could not agree more. Our issue, Mr. Speaker, is that the Minister of Education has had two opportunities, one in April and one in October of 2012, to do that by introducing legislation which has been recognized to be very weak. The response in the statement of April 18th, our caucus noted that those opportunities were 14 months overdue. There was the government task force with a broad range of expertise, and that task force presented a report with 85 recommendations to the Minister of Education back in February of 2012. Members of that task force, including the chair, Wayne McKay, have been less than impressed by this government's weak response. Parents asked the government at that time to accept recommendations from the task force, and the All-Party Law Amendments Committee heard from one of those parents who had suffered the tragic loss of her daughter, who took her own life as a result of bullying and cyberbullying. She pleaded with the Law Amendments Committee to begin discussions with the federal government on changes to the criminal code, and the NDP members absolutely refused to support that amendment. There have been other young girls whose families have looked to this government for help. However, it was not until the most recent and tragic case, which, in the Premier's own words, garnered international attention, that he decided to begin the discussions in Ottawa regarding the criminal code. Parents are questioning why the Premier did not show leadership when the task force recommendation number 44 was presented 14 months ago. And that recommendation reads, and I will quote, "It is recommended that the Provincial Minister of Justice make representations to the Federal Minister of Justice about evaluating the effectiveness of current criminal code provisions in responding to bullying and cyberbullying and exploring the pros and cons of a distinct crime of bullying and cyberbullying." End of quote. The question that Nova Scotians have: why was that recommendation not accepted and acted upon 14 months ago? Another question: why did the legislation that the Minister of Education introduced as a result of that task force's recommendations not address the very issue? As I stated, Mr. Speaker, in my response to the Minister's statement on April 18th, it is time to take meaningful action. We cannot fail another young person in this province, and I know the Minister believes that. The Liberal caucus supports, as we have said, any real steps that this government will take to protect our young people.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am very pleased to rise and speak to the Minister's statement about cyberbullying and technology today, including sexual violence against our young people. The world is certainly a very different place than when many of us, all of us in this chamber, went to school, started out in life. I know that we all are determined to see that our laws federally and provincially are modernized to reflect today's reality and protect the 21st century's version of young Nova Scotians. Indeed, there are gaps in the criminal code, Mr. Speaker, that need to be closed. I know the Premier and I have both communicated to the Prime Minister of Canada about the need to modernize the criminal code. And when we do those things as fellow Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the Minister that we speak as one voice when in Ottawa. You know, Mr. Speaker, my dad is from Pictou County, and he taught me when I was young, we may argue like cats and dogs between Stellarton and Glasgow, Pictou, and so on, but when you get over Mount Tom, we're all from Pictou County. And when Nova Scotians go to Ottawa, as yesterday, to seek changes to the criminal code, we are all as one. And so I'm pleased that we have been able to add our voice to the Parsons family and to the Premier in seeking those changes that we need to protect our young people in the criminal code. But, Mr. Speaker, changes to the criminal code will take time. They don't happen overnight. I am pleased to note that the Federal Minister of Justice, Mr. Nicholson, has said today that he wants to see a complete set of changes enacted by the end of June. In national terms, that is relatively quick action to protect our young people, and I applaud Mr. Nicholson for that. The same is true, Mr. Speaker, of the laws of Nova Scotia. There are gaps in our own provincial laws that don't reflect today's 21st century modern reality of cyberbullying and technology. And I call on the Minister and the government to take similar action with our provincial laws, particularly to take aim at providing our law enforcement officials, our prosecutors, our schools, with all the tools of early intervention, prevention, to do what we can as a province to prevent these activities before they become criminal and the criminal code needs to take over, Mr. Speaker. Provincially, we can define bullying and cyberbullying in law and make it an offence and spell out the consequences to bullies of their actions. Provincially, we can give our law enforcement officials, our schools, our teachers, the tools they need, our judges, the tools they need to intervene before it ever gets to the criminal level, Mr. Speaker. The power to confiscate laptops and cell phones when they're used as weapons against our own children. The power to shut down internet accounts when they're also used as weapons against our own children. That would be an important step to modernizing the laws of Nova Scotia. These are actions within the power of the province of Nova Scotia to take. And I encourage the minister and the government to take them now. And Mr. Speaker, we could also show that we're truly leaders in this province by adapting all of the recommendations of the McKay Task Force report, and not just some, including those that specifically spell out what needs to be done to intervene in our schools before bullying gets to the criminal level. Mr. Speaker, protecting our children is the #1 job of all of us as parents, and I know every member knows that. And so too is it true of government, that protecting our young people is the #1 job of a responsible and active government. A few weeks ago, Nova Scotia made the national and indeed international news for tragic reasons. Now is the time for action. Now is the time for Nova Scotia to be a leader in the prevention and intervention of cases when we see it, of criminal activity, of bullying and cyberbullying, and all of the harmful effects that we're reminded of far too often. And so I sincerely hope that the minister is bringing forward positive, active, constructive, action-oriented legislation in this session of the legislature, so Nova Scotia truly can be that leader in the protection of our children that we all aspire to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Esther Shute celebrated her 100th birthday at the Berwick Fire Hall April 21st in the afternoon with hundreds of friends and family following a late night of square dancing and after attending her morning church service. And whereas Esther has dedicated her life to serving her community and in fact was awarded the Provincial Volunteer Award in 2011 and has recently been honored by her community in her 100th year for her unfailing volunteer work. She is an active member of her square dancing group called Bells and Bows and the Women's Institute. And whereas Esther is known for communication skills through her cards, notes, and letters, she is now excited about learning how to use a computer so she can keep in touch with her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren with her new computer. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Esther Shute from Berwick on her 100th birthday and wish her continual good health and happiness for years to come. And I hereby, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas non-profit organizations across the province provide services to many Nova Scotians most vulnerable. And whereas every day Feed Nova Scotia helps many individuals and families make ends meet by providing healthy food and groceries. And whereas Diane Swinimer recently announced that she is stepping down as Executive Director of the Feed Nova Scotia Board after 20 years of dedicated work with the organization, therefore be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly join together in congratulating Diane Swinimer on her successful career with Feed Nova Scotia and thank her for her years of hard work and dedication providing food for Nova Scotians most in need. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia has 165 agencies, boards and commissions that play an important role in the province through their quasi-judicial responsibilities and by providing advice to government of a wide range of subjects. And whereas these organizations rely mostly on dedicated Nova Scotians to volunteer their time, expertise and experience, and would benefit from representation from a range of backgrounds and demographics. And whereas the province is currently seeking applications for present vacancies and openings that arise in agencies, boards and commissions over the coming year, and is encouraging women and members of underrepresented groups in particular to apply. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly encourage all Nova Scotians, and in particular women and those from underrepresented groups, to get involved and learn more about opportunities for civic engagement, including putting their name forward to be considered for one of the province's agencies, boards and commissions. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Gaelic Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today, April 24th, a new exhibit called Nan Gael and Albanuig, The Gaels in Nova Scotia, opened at the Nova Scotia Museum of Natural History and will run throughout Gaelic Awareness Month in May. And whereas the new exhibit shows how the Gaels who settled throughout eastern Nova Scotia proudly passed their language, culture and traditions down through the generations and have persisted through great adversity. And whereas Nova Scotia's Gaelic community has a strong, unbroken connection to the past, as well as the energy of young community members who will carry the Gaelic spirit into the future. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly thank all of the contributors for helping to bring the Gaels in Nova Scotia exhibit together for Nova Scotia families, and wish all Nova Scotians a great Gaelic Awareness Month. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Clayva. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas across Canada, 4 out of every 20,000 people are diagnosed with sarcoidosis, an autoimmune inflammatory disease that affects everyone of any age, race, or gender. And whereas April marks Sarcoidosis Awareness Month in Nova Scotia and across Canada, a month to bring added awareness to this debilitating and often misunderstood disease. Whereas the National Sarcoidosis Organization encourages everyone to wear purple and white to show support for the Day of Awareness during the month. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the month of April, as Sarcoidosis Awareness Month, and the dedicated work of the members of the National Sarcoidosis Organization to raise awareness of this disease. Mr. Speaker, I ask waiver of notice and passage without debate. No.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas, involving students and teachers in activities that promote sustainability, creative thinking and teamwork is key to ensuring a prosperous future for both students and this province, and whereas the Resource Recovery Fund Board recently held its contest, Nova Scotia Recycles, aimed at teachers and students. students. And whereas over 8,600 entries from 220 schools were received by the contest judging committee. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate and thank the students and teachers for taking action and promoting waste reduction in their community by participating in the Resource Recovery Funds Board's 2012-13 Nova Scotia Recycles Contest. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas library users now have access to a large collection of French language e-books by French-Canadian authors, courtesy of a partnership between the Nova Scotia Provincial Library and the Office of Acadian Affairs, and whereas the Provincial Library had been looking into options to build on its collection of French language e-books available to library patrons across the province through its digital media collection website, and whereas the partnership resulted in the purchase of 204 titles that are accessible through 9 regional library boards and delivered through the Provincial Library's digital media collection website to users across the province, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly joins me in recognizing this partnership between the Nova Scotia Provincial Library and the Office of Acadian Affairs, which will support lifelong learning in the Acadian and Francophone community by improving access to French language e-books and French-Canadian literature, fostering the development of the French language and culture in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas National Immunization Awareness Week occurs in Canada between April 20th to April 27th, and whereas immunization has long been a cornerstone of our public health system, and whereas immunization is a cost-beneficial health intervention that contributes to keeping Nova Scotians safe and healthy, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the importance of marking National Immunization Awareness Week and thank all those in our public health and healthcare system who participate in administering vaccines. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, and I'm reading this on behalf of the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. Whereas a number of schools in Nova Scotia participated in the 7th annual WOW Reading Challenge sponsored by the Adopt a Library Literacy Program, and whereas 87 schools with 14,000 students participated, the majority being from Nova Scotia, but including schools from as far away as Medicine Hat, Alberta, and South Africa. And whereas the Reading Challenge is hosted by the Pictou-Antigonish Regional Library through a partnership with the RCMP, local policing agencies, schools, school boards, and community members. Therefore, be resolved that the members of this House join me in congratulating all schools and students who participated in promoting a culture of reading in this province, thus contributing to more literate communities. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the attention of the host of the West Gallery. We're visiting us today, Adrian White. Adrian is a young man who enjoys politics, and his father has the good fortune of working with me. But I want to assure everybody in this house that it was his mother who gave him permission to be out of school today to be here to get his real education. So Adrian, welcome, and I'd ask everyone to give him a warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope the young lad enjoys this afternoon's proceedings. I will now call introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1987 the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Nova Scotia Act.
The Honourable Minister of Energy begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1987, the Canadian-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Nova Scotia Act.
Bill number 59, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1987, the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Nova Scotia Act.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. We now recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park begs leave to introduce the bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Residential Tenancy Act.
Bill number 60, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 401 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Residential Tenancies Act.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today, April 24th, is Administrative Professionals Day, a day which recognizes and celebrates the work of secretaries, administrative assistants, and other office professionals for their invaluable contribution to the workplace. And whereas administrative professionals play a critical role in coordinating the office operations of our MLAs and caucus offices, government, businesses, educational and health-related institutions, and countless other organizations. And whereas day in and day out, administrative professionals are on the front lines acting as invaluable ambassadors for our workplaces, keeping us on time and organizing, and are living proof every day that an organization is only as strong as its parts. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge today, April 24th, as Administrative Professionals Day and extend our appreciation to all administrative professionals for the critical role they play in not only our success, but in the success of companies and organizations across our province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cape Breton Regional Municipality has presented the provincial and federal governments with a 5-year capital plan, and whereas this plan will equate to over 700 direct and indirect jobs in the depressed area of our province that is currently struggling with an 18.6% unemployment rate. And whereas the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has committed to 25% of the cost of the plan, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House support the commitment made by the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations beginning this year, so that the Cape Breton Regional Municipality can go forward immediately with their capital plan. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I do my resolution, could I be permitted to make an introduction?
Most certainly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to draw the members' attention to the East Gallery, where we have some very special guests with us today. And I'm going to read their names, and as I read their names, I would ask them to stand and then receive the warm welcome of the House. So, Mr. Speaker, with us today are the members of the Hope Blooms Fresh group who make herb salad dressing in the north end of Halifax. And they are Craig Kane, Tiffany Calvin, Christiana Ubley, Folai Imi Kola Wole Bobo Ya, Kola De Kola Wale Bobo Ya, Bokar Wade, and Mamadou Wade, and they are accompanied by their leaders, Jesse Jollymore and Serena Piercy.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I'll now recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the North End Community Garden in Halifax was founded in 2007 as an initiative of the North End Community Health Centre, and is where Hope Bloom's Fresh Herb Salad Dressing is an initiative of young people of the community who have tended their own gardens for the past 3 seasons, as well as making and selling their very own brand of delicious salad dressing, and who now want to take their enterprise to the next level. And whereas CBC TV's hit program, Dragon's Den, provides an opportunity for courageous, aspiring entrepreneurs to pitch their business concepts and products to a panel of Canadian business moguls who have the cash and the know-how to make things happen if they're impressed. And whereas 7 young people and 3 adults from Hope Blooms will be traveling this week to Toronto to make a pitch to the Dragons in their den, which will be broadcast on CBC TV in weeks to come. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Hope Blooms Fresh team going to Toronto, as well as all of the children and community members who have worked on the North End Community Garden and on Hope Blooms, as well as the supporting organization and individuals, and wish the Hope Blooms team great success when they enter the Dragon's Den. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. I would like to remind all our guests in the galleries that under the rules of our host, they are not to show either approval, disapproval, or anything that happens on the floor. They are the rules of the Assembly. I will now recognize the honourable member for Bedford Birch Grove on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the members' attention to the West Gallery of the House, where we have yet another group of very impressive students. These students are here from Bedford Junior High. They're part of Team 35. Now, Noah Bugden is not with us today. His flight was delayed, but we have Robin Wells. Please stand as your name is called. Robin Wells, Tristan Kays, Aidan DeVoe, and their teacher, Julia Hill. And I have a resolution, Mr. Speaker, that I would like to read explaining what the team is about. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I should move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Noah Bugden, Robin Wells, Tristan Kays, and Aidan DeVoe, all grade 7 students at Bedford Junior High School, entered a science fair called the Destination Imagination Challenge. And whereas these 4 boys, who call themselves Team 35, won first place at the Twistorama Engineering category of the competition, by building a structure out of duct tape and bamboo, which weighed less than 150 grams and held more than 550 grams of weight, and whereas Team 35, along with one other team, was chosen to represent Nova Scotia at the Destination Imagination Global Finals this May in Knoxville, Tennessee, therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate teacher Julia Hill and team members Noah Bugden, Robin Wells, Tristan Kays, and Aidan DeVoe on their engineering prowess and wish them best of luck in the international competition. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West on the introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery, where Amy Graves is seated. And of course, she is a great advocate in the prescription drug issue. And along with her are Dale Gelada and Tom Adams, parents of the late Olivia Gelada, who will join Amy now with advocacy and education. And if we could give them a warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to our gallery and hope they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Frankie McDonald, resident of Sydney and someone who is very familiar to you, Mr. Speaker, and the Whitney Bear Youth Club, has become famous for his weather reporting YouTube videos. And whereas Frankie's commitment to weather reporting is recognized by his thousands of fans across the world, and his videos have been featured on both Canadian and American newscasts. And whereas today is Frankie's birthday. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Frankie McDonald on his international success. We wish him the best of luck in future weather reporting and a very happy birthday. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
And he'll probably want his senators to win the cup. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sunday marked the official beginning of 300 celebrations of the founding of Isle Royale, now known as modern-day Cape Breton Island, with Louisbourg as its capital. And whereas Louisbourg has been perched on the edge of the continent for 300 years and was a bustling seaport and a hub of trade and commerce on the Atlantic, a multicultural, multilingual community, and France's prize in the New World. And whereas today Louisbourg is North America's largest historical reconstruction, where thousands of visitors interact with costume animators immersed in the sights, sounds, and smells of this once mighty 18th century fortress. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the organizers of this very special anniversary and show their support by wearing the pins that are on their desks to promote this very special occasion. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Chronicle Herald hosted the 5th annual Nova Scotia Spelling Bee at the Citadel High School Spats Theatre on Saturday, March the 30th, and whereas 54 students from across Nova Scotia competed for the provincial Spelling Bee crown, and whereas Jack Dow, a grade 7 student at George P. Vanier School in Fall River, competed, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Jack Dow on his accomplishments and wish him continued success. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today is Administrative Professionals Day, and whereas this is an opportunity to recognize and show gratitude for the hard work and attention to detail of administrative staff, and whereas administrative professionals are the backbone of every workplace and are essential to every operation. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge today as Administrative Professionals Day and take the time to thank our own administrative staff for everything they do and tell them that we couldn't do it without them. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Acadia Robot Programming Competition's mission is to foster interest in computer programming, science, math, problem solving, and teamwork among students in both junior and senior high schools. And whereas the 2012-13 iteration of the Acadia Robot Programming Competition took place February the 2nd and featured over 50 teams from across Nova Scotia, and whereas the event was a spectacular success, continuing to grow in size and scope with each passing year due to the efforts of event staff and organizers at the Jodrey School of Computer Science at Acadia University. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate all event staff, volunteers, sponsors, and participants for their contributions in making the 2012-13 Acadia Robot Programming Competition in Wolfville a successful and memorial learning experience. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday at Halifax City Hall, residents of Timberley Prospect spoke out loudly and against any changes to the Otter Lake Waste Management Facility. And whereas the Otter Lake Waste Management Facility operates according to a permit issued by the Department of Environment. And whereas the member for Timberley Prospect and local councillors have diligently represented the concerns of local residents on this issue. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly direct the Minister of Environment to reject any request changes to the Otter Lake Waste Management Facility operating permit that will remove the requirement of front-end separation and waste stabilization. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in the very cold month of December in 2012, a hardy group of actors and a one-man film crew took to the roads and streets of Pictou County to be part of a short film written, directed, and edited by Chris Bolter of Linesbrook, Pictou County. And whereas the short film is called The Duffel Bag, and it was filmed entirely in Pictou County using local actors, extras, and locations. And whereas on February the 16th, 2013, The Duffel Bag had a very successful screening to a large audience at the Pictou Legion, and future plans include submission to the 2013 Atlantic Film Festival and the 2013 Toronto Film Festival. Therefore, it be resolved, this House of Assembly congratulates Chris Bolter of Linesbrook, Pictou County, for writing, directing, and editing the short film, The Duffel Bag, and wishes him success in the upcoming film festivals. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today marks 98 years since the start of the Armenian genocide. Whereas Armenian people around the world mark this day by remembering the more than 1 million people who were victims of mass murder and horrific ethnic cleansing. Whereas the Armenian people were subjected to forced deportation, expropriation, abduction, torture, and starvation as well. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House remember all those who were needlessly killed, and let today serve as a reminder that we must do everything we can to protect our freedoms and eradicate prejudice and intolerance wherever it exists. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Sherbrooke Village Restoration Commission is a provincially significant heritage attraction that preserves and interprets the rich past of history, or the rich past of Sherbrooke, and oversees the planning of programs within the Sherbrooke planning area. And whereas Don Dunbar was a municipal representative on the Sherbrooke Restoration Commission for 11 years. And whereas on December 13th, 2012, Sherbrooke Village had a Christmas dinner to celebrate Don Dunbar's retirement from this position after his long-time service to the Restoration Committee and the community of Sherbrooke. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly extend congratulations to Don Dunbar on his retirement and thank him for his dedicated service to both his position and his community, and wish him a happy and healthy retirement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Eastern Passage resident and former École de Carrefour student Alicia Lapierre was part of Karim Amejku's grade 12 class that came up with an idea to host a 2-week summer camp for marginalized youth in Algeria. And whereas the class idea beat out 400 other nominations countrywide for a $5,000 scholarship from Education First Educational Tours Teachers Matter contest. And whereas Alicia, along with 4 other students and 3 teachers, will be heading to Algeria in August to host a camp for 15 disadvantaged youth aged 10 to 18 in Kabylie, Algeria. Therefore, be it resolved that this Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulate Alicia Lapierre of Eastern Passage for her work as a caring and responsible citizen by helping Algerian children have a summer experience they'll never forget. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas MLA constituency assistants are the foundation of the provincial government through their understanding of the political process, possessing knowledge of how to access services, serving as facilitators for communication between constituents and their MLAs, and providing follow-up to constituents. And whereas Judy Milne, constituency assistant to the MLA for Queens, in addition to strengthening the ability of her MLA to represent her constituents, she has consistently risen above her duties to ensure respect, consideration, and acknowledgement is provided to all constituents. And whereas today we honour all administrative professionals throughout Nova Scotia for the value and expertise they bring to their roles. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognizes Judy Milne for her contribution and dedication to the political process, and her MLA for Queens congratulates her on her outstanding performance in her position as constituency assistant. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the importance of literacy touches us all and impacts our lives for the better. And whereas Maggie's Place and CanU have organized a family literacy event the wonderful world of Wizards Literacy Day to show how much fun and how important and engaging reading, writing, and your imagination can be to those who need a good start the most, our youth. And whereas those involved have given the youth encouragement to get an early start and become interested in reading and writing for the rest of their lives. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly join me in thanking Maggie's Place and CanU for their commitment to the youngest members of our community. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice, and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kyle Greenlaw, a 14-year-old from Middle Sackville, is one of the youngest people ever to have successfully created an iPad app, an iPhone and iPad app. And whereas Kyle Greenlaw game app, iPoke, which has a free and a 99-cent version, was released in December of 2012 and was featured with him and his mother on the national news morning show Canada AM. And whereas his initiative and perseverance has shown that our young students can achieve whatever they put their mind to with hard work and ambition. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize and congratulates Kyle Greenlaw of Middle Sackville on developing and now marketing his own iPhone and iPad app while being one of the youngest people ever to do so. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Port Williams Women's Institute, one of the original founding chapters of the Women's Institutes of Canada in 1913, marks its 100th anniversary of service for home and country in 2013, and whereas the dedicated members of the Port Williams Women's Institute have, over the past 100 years, strengthened their community and country by supporting a wide range of projects, including Red Cross work during World Wars I and II, gift boxes to children of the Spring Hill mine disaster, educational scholarships, financial support to 4-H groups, Brownies and Guides, Chrysalis House, the Kings County Music Festival, and the Apple Blossom Festival, as well as safety measures such as Buckle Up Baby, Adopt a Highway, Safe Grad, and Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and programs particular to rural life, such as promoting the use of reflective triangles on farm vehicles and farm safety workshops for children. And whereas the Port Williams Women's Institute will celebrate its continuing good deeds and good fellowship with a series of events throughout 2013, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulates the Port Williams Women's Institute for its 100 years of service to Nova Scotia and Canada, and acknowledges its exemplary contributions to our community, to Nova Scotia, and to Canada. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas National Volunteer Week 2013 takes place in April 21st to April 27th, a specific week designated to thank and honor people who donate their time to help others by supporting causes in which they believe. And whereas Nova Scotia has a very high level of volunteerism, almost 1/2 of Nova Scotians participating in the voluntary sector, delivering programs and services that build healthy community and vibrant community. Whereas the Nova Scotia Provincial Volunteer Awards, held on April 15, 2013, recognizes the volunteer contributions of Sue Kelly of Lunenburg for her community involvement. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulates Sue Kelly of the town of Lunenburg on receiving the Provincial Volunteer Award on April 15, 2013. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Charles O. Dillman of Myers Grant was honoured in October 2012
for his commitment and dedication as a 50-year member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. And whereas this honour was extended by IBEW Local 625 with the presentation of a pin and citation attesting to the union's sincere affection and deep gratitude for Charlie's loyal and faithful years of membership in the union. And whereas in making this presentation on the union's behalf, Local 625 business manager Tim Swinimer made reference to Charlie's commitment and dedication to the Brotherhood, extending over a significant part of the IBEW's 104-year history. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly joins the members of IBEW Local 625 in honouring Charlie Dillman's attainment of this professional half-century milestone. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is on the better side of 3:14, and we will finish at 4:44. I will now recognize the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the CBRM Mayor and Council, Island MLAs and MPs, and many residents were encouraged by the commitment from the provincial government to support the municipality with 25 cents for every federal dollar allocated for the CBRM capital plan. While this is a great starting point, Mr. Speaker, we would like the province to clarify their commitment to our capital plan. As indicated by the CBRM, if the province matches our municipality's investment, we could begin to see the benefits of this plan in this current fiscal year. So my question, can the Premier confirm that his government will match the investment which has already been committed by the CBRM in this current fiscal year?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to meet with the Mayor and members of the CBRM Council and to review their capital plan today. I reiterated the commitment that we have already made. They asked me about whether or not, if money was to come forward in this year. I indicated to them that I would be happy to consider that if it happens. We want to encourage the federal investment in the province, and certainly we would encourage the effective use of our money to trigger a larger investment in CBRM, or for that matter in other parts of the province.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cape Breton's employment numbers are certainly alarming. 18.6% unemployment and climbing, Mr. Speaker. The highest unemployment in any city in Atlantic Canada, in Sydney. Out-migration of thousands of families over the last number of years, and ownership of $454 million in wastewater improvements in the next decade, a cost that we simply can't afford, Mr. Speaker. This plan will keep families home. It will put tradespeople back to work, and it'll grow the Cape Breton economy, which has certainly experienced negative growth for a number of years. Mr. Speaker, plain and simple, our municipality needs this. So to clarify again for the Premier, if the federal government commits to the CBRM capital plan, will the Premier live up to his commitment for the 2013-2014 fiscal year?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've already said that we're prepared to consider the request from CBRM. We have a capital plan in place. What I told them was that we would be prepared to go back and reconsider the capital plan if money was available, because we want to make use of any investment that would come from the federal government, and we're happy to do that. I also explained that that capital planning for the province takes place in the fall, so that they would know for future years that this is the best way to prepare for budgeting. But Mr. Speaker, I also indicated to them that what would very much be important to the CBRM are investments, good investments in jobs like IIBG, like the Maritime Link, which would be very beneficial to the people of Cape Breton. So maybe the next time the member from Glace Bay stands up, maybe he can say whether or not he would support those investments.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the CBRM capital plan, the CBRM has constructed a real plan for the economy in Cape Breton. This plan will address the crumbling infrastructure, get hundreds of Cape Breton tradespeople back to work, and provide a much-needed injection to the local economy, and indeed the economy of the entire province. This also has potential to bridge the gap to new opportunities related to port initiatives, natural resource development, and tourism expansion. But for this to succeed, the Premier needs to ensure that the capital plan is presented to the federal government as a provincial priority, one that the entire province can get behind, Mr. Speaker. So my question, will the Premier confirm in this House right now that he's willing to put the plan forward to the federal government as a provincial priority for the province of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I will confirm that I have agreed with the Mayor of CBRM to work with him on this project. We're prepared to do that. We've said it over and over again. We've reiterated it in letters. I've answered this here before. My hope, though, is that on the wider question associated with economic development, the member opposite and the members opposite, for that matter, will recognize the kinds of investments that are necessary by government in business in order to ensure that there's real economic development and growth in areas like Cape Breton, and understand that when we make commitments, whether it's to companies like IBG or to the Maritime Link or to Port Hawkesbury paper, they are important for the growth of the economy in that region.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the CBRM capital plan addresses much-needed projects and community infrastructure. Cape Breton has been hit hard by unemployment, out-migration, and the CBRM has a plan to breathe new life into crumbling capital and local infrastructure. The reality is that the potential of this new capital plan is contingent on a commitment from the province. My question to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia: does the province currently have the money they've promised for CBRM? Crews in Cape Breton are shovel-ready and waiting to go.
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I got to say, I'm not sure why the opposition doesn't understand that yes means yes. We indicated.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, we may not spend 5 cents. It depends on the feds. The letter that I sent to the Mayor and Council was that we were in for 25 cents on the dollar, based or contingent on the federal government coming forward with their money, and so that's what I signed my name to. That's what I stand behind.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
So, Mr. Speaker, the CBRM needs absolute clarity on the province's commitment to $75 million over this 5 years. We cannot afford to be given any more half-hearted conditional promises by the NDP government. So I think what I'm hearing, Mr. Speaker, is will the minister give us unconditional commitment that the government is on board and this is a provincial priority?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Yeah, look, Mr. Speaker, I signed my name to a piece of paper that said we were committed, and that we were committed on the basis of the federal government coming forward with their money, and I mean their money in a reasonable time. In other words, we're not going to carry the load on this funding, and in 3 years or 5 years, they finally backfill it with some federal money. So we want a real clear commitment of their money and when it's going to be available, and when we know that, then we'll make our money available. The members opposite may want to read my correspondence. The mayor had copies of it this morning at breakfast. I think he took it to each of the caucuses. I think it's quite clear what I signed, and I stand behind what I signed, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, after ripping up the MOU with the municipalities know how much to rely on that signature, Mr. Speaker. The truth, Mr. Speaker, is the past treatment of Cape Breton by this government gives the people of the island reason to be wary of their commitments. Without an absolute guarantee that the province will provide the money, the situation starts to look more like what the government did in Yarmouth. By cutting the ferry that devastated the community of Nova Scotia and the entire region. We hope the government has learned from this mistake. So my question is, will the minister immediately conclude an agreement with CBRM so they can become a model of job creation and long-term planning for other similar municipalities to follow?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. Order, please. That'll be enough for this afternoon on all sides of the House. Okay. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, my signature wasn't on the MOU. So, and if the members opposite want to check the MOU, they'll find the signature that was on it, which has a Tory, former Tory minister's signature. And the page with the signatures had a clause in it that the government could move away based on its ability to fund it. So the members opposite may not like it, but they signed it, Mr. Speaker. So I reiterate to the member who asked the question that I stand behind my signature on the letter that I sent to the Mayor and Council. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent TV appearance, Mr. Speaker, when asked about cyberbullying, the Premier responded, and I quote, "In order for people to take this seriously, there has to be a criminal sanction," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education's appointed task force on cyberbullying submitted its recommendations to government in February of 2012. In recommendation 44 states, and I quote, "It is recommended that the Provincial Minister of Justice make representation to the Federal Minister of Justice about evaluating the effectiveness of the current criminal code provisions in responding to bullying and cyberbullying, and explore the pros and cons of a distinct crime of bullying and cyberbullying," end of quote. So my question to the Premier, why did the government not take this recommendation seriously when it was brought to his government a full 14 months ago?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we took all of the recommendations seriously. They are the basins of the action plan that we have moved forward with since then. In fact, the Minister of Justice is the co-chair of the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Cybercrime. They are working very specifically on these kinds of provisions. I understand from my conversation yesterday with the Prime Minister that he will be consulting with that working group and are looking for language around the kind of legislation, the kind of reforms that we are seeking with the criminal code.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the conversation that the Minister of Justice is having today, Mr. Speaker, the committee that was struck by the Minister of Education 14 months ago recommended that the province start that conversation 14 months ago, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the Law Amendments Committee, Mr. Speaker, we heard from Pam Murchison, a mother who lost her daughter as a result of the cruelty of cyberbullying on May 3rd, 2012. She was bringing her daughter's issue to the forefront and pleaded with the committee to accept recommendation number 44. So again, my question to the Premier, why didn't the Premier act earlier, and why didn't the Premier act to protect our kids at the first opportunity instead of waiting 14 months?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is simply misinformed. The reality is that task force has been in place now for some time. As I said, not only are we participating in it, the Minister of Justice is one of the co-chairs. They're the ones who are bringing forward recommendations, and they're examining these issues. We're obviously an important part of that committee, and of course we're committed to that. I made very clear our intentions yesterday with the Prime Minister, but that is only the latest, of course, in a long string of representations that we've made on this matter.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
What we know for sure is that recommendation number 4 was defeated by the NDP government on law amendments, Mr. Speaker, on April 2012, and in October 2012, Mr. Speaker. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. And what their own government's task force asked for was that this government start a conversation 14 months ago with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. Not only did they sit on the recommendation number 44, Mr. Speaker, but recommendation number 42 is, and I quote, "It is recommended that the Nova Scotia Department of Justice, the Nova Scotia Chief Civil Police Association, and Internet service providers work together to develop a protocol to facilitate police access to information during the investigation of bullying and cyberbullying," Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, when can Nova Scotians expect this government to act on recommendation 44 and allow our police forces to have the tools they need to protect our children?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is particularly ironic that the critic for the opposition was both the Education Minister and the Health Minister, and in 10 years did absolutely nothing on bullying. Did absolutely nothing on bullying. And in 14 months, we have done more to move Nova Scotia into the leadership in this country on cyberbullying than they would have ever have dreamed of, Mr. Speaker. It is this government that is moving forward to ensure that we protect our young people. It is this government that is putting in place the educational standards, they're putting in place the supports in the healthcare system to help our young people, Mr. Speaker. I know that out there parents will not give way to the cynicism and the negativity of the opposition.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we all know, the power of educating our youngest citizens is key to economic success. But what we don't oftentimes link is the power that education has when it comes to saving lives. Mr. Speaker, the world has changed. The prevalence of prescription drugs has piqued the curiosity of our youngest citizens and is playing havoc with the lives of our young people. Unfortunately, we're hearing more and more about the tragic outcomes associated with prescription drugs, when time after time we hear the countless stories of lives that are ending far too soon. Could the Minister of Health and Wellness outline what role he plays to ensure drug education in our schools remains relevant and is incorporated into the school curriculum?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member opposite for bringing this question forward. I know all members in the House are disturbed when we hear cases of prescription drugs and death of abuse of prescription drug, Mr. Speaker. It's as a father, and I know almost everybody in here as a parent couldn't imagine having to go through that ordeal. As Minister of Health, I've worked with many partners throughout different departments, but outside partners. I know Captain or Chief Mander from the Valley, for example. After becoming Minister of Health, I've requested a meeting with him. We sat down to make sure that we're working together and moving forward to make sure that everybody who can make a difference in preventing one death, we do all that we can do. So we had a rigorous TV campaign around awareness. I think that's one of the key things we need to ensure is to educate our young people on the importance of the dangers around prescription drug abuse, the mixing of alcohol and prescription drugs, Mr. Speaker. But I'm also working with our ministers, Minister of Education, on a number of programs that I hope will start that education at the earliest possible time. And of course, some of them is through the Schools Plus program that we have in place throughout the province. And I look forward to continue to work with ministers. I continue to work with partners in law enforcement and clinicians in the community to make sure that we can do everything we can to prevent any deaths in the future.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again last week, another family went public when Dale Gelada spoke of the tragic death of her daughter Olivia, passed away in April 2012. She was just 15 years old. A bright young junior high student in Dartmouth took one Dilaudid that was ultimately ruled some 9 months later to be the single cause of her death. Her parents spoke publicly for the need for more education around drug awareness, more so than ever at an earlier age. The Minister of Education explained to us what she has been doing to assure that drug education remains relevant and incorporated into the school curriculum, especially at the upper elementary, middle, and junior high grades.
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for bringing this very important topic to the floor today. This is a very serious problem that we're dealing with in Nova Scotia and other jurisdictions across Canada. I know that everything is being done in every department to raise awareness around the dangers of prescription drugs. It is incorporated in our curriculum right from primary, teaching children about prescription drugs not being candy, for example. The very, very early education of keeping one safe from primary right through. I know that the member asked what was happening in our education system. It is incorporated from primary through to the junior high grades, through health. It is also incorporated in other areas, healthy living and in health. There is a curriculum that addresses it at grade 9, and one of the things is that the prescription drug use continues to change. The drugs continue to change. So we are working with the health department and with the professionals in the health department to make sure that our education is relevant and up to date. And so we will continue to do that to make sure that the curriculum that we are offering our children bring the very best available resources so that we make sure that our children know not to use prescription drugs. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure where to start with that response because in the junior high program there is one paragraph of outdated information. Mr. Speaker, interesting, the minister should say really all of this. I have a copy of an email sent to parents from a teacher in an elementary school in Dartmouth. In fact, this elementary school feeds into the same junior high that Olivia was attending. The email in part reads as follows, and I will table this. In health, we will be starting our unit on healthy self. The grade 6 outcomes have changed, and we no longer do a unit on drugs. However, we do still cover a few outcomes on sexual health. Mr. Speaker, the world is changing. This minister and this government refuses to believe it. This is unacceptable. Could the minister please explain to all members of the legislature why the grade 6 outcomes have changed so that our youngest citizens, the very students who are getting ready to enter junior high, are no longer receiving education on drugs and the lethal impacts that they have on their lives?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are working in our school system to raise awareness around the dangers of prescription drug use, especially when mixed with alcohol and not using other people's medications. I misspoke when I said teaching children not to use prescription drugs, but I meant was not using prescription drugs that are not their own or to mix them. Our school guidance counselors are working very closely with addiction services and also with our DHAs. We are making sure that there's information through our guidance counselors and through our curriculum, throughout our whole system. We are really very concerned about the prevalence of prescription drug misuse and abuse, and we will do everything that we can to make sure that the information that we provide our children is current, up to date, relevant, so that we can make sure that children are very aware not to misuse drugs. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier met with the Prime Minister about modernizing the Criminal Code of Canada to protect our kids against assault or sexual assault, or bullying, or the distribution of intimate pictures on the internet. That is all good, Mr. Speaker, and we all support that. But there is also a role for the province to play in updating our provincial laws to protect children by way of early intervention and prevention before activities ever get to the criminal level. I asked the Premier, will he commit to updating Nova Scotia's laws by introducing and passing in this session of the legislature strong protective legislation for our kids?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, in any legislative session, there are additional pieces of legislation coming forward. We intend to do that with respect to this issue as well. What I can say, though, is that we're not going to limit the protection that we have just to children. The fact of the matter is that simply because a person passes out of their minority and into young adulthood does not mean that society should stop protecting them or their personal integrity. The simple matter of the fact is that people who are engaged in this kind of behavior and activity, they act maliciously, they act with the intent to harm people, and those kinds of activities ought to attract the appropriate sanction. In this country, where that appropriate sanction comes from is the Criminal Code of Canada. That's why I was in Ottawa yesterday to speak to the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to report to the Leader of the Conservative Party that he takes the same position.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Premier for that answer, and of course we take the same position, and no one is suggesting that protections for Canadian citizens or our fellow Nova Scotians should stop when they reach adult age, Mr. Speaker, but the fact of the matter is the Premier has gone to Ottawa, the Premier is pointing at the criminal code, but he is the Premier of Nova Scotia and has the power to strengthen and modernize Nova Scotia law as well, particularly to provide the tools that our law enforcement officials need, the prosecutors need, that school officials need to intervene in cases where they see bullying or cyberbullying in the modern age. Nova Scotians are waiting for someone to act, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I want to ask the Premier again, will he bring in meaningful, strong provincial legislation on bullying and cyberbullying and all that's associated with it here in Nova Scotia, introduce it and pass it in this session of the legislature?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've already brought in legislation. As he would know from his time here in the House, we intend to continue with that, but as he would also know, we carry on these conversations with the federal government. We respect their jurisdiction and where that lies with them. We think they should act. We don't fill, as they say, fill the field that should be inhabited by the federal government. I've seen some of the suggestions that the Leader of the Conservative Party has made. I believe some of them are of a constructive nature. We have been considering them, along with all of the other input that we have received with respect to these matters, and shortly legislation will come forward. I want him to know that in many cases, what he's asking for is, in fact, already covered. The jurisdiction of the courts is a broad one in these matters, and judges are able to exercise this jurisdiction if they so choose. However, we are, of course, engaged in ensuring that the legislation that we introduce will be effective in terms of ensuring that we provide the best possible protection for whether it's children or adults.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is considering an awful lot of things these days, but Nova Scotians want action. The federal government, faced with the same challenges across our whole country, is today committed to bringing forward amendments to the Criminal Code by June, the month after next. Mr. Speaker, he said that today in his meetings with Justice Ministers, including our provincial Justice Ministers. I'll get that for the Premier if he's unsure of what the federal government is committed to. The time for consideration has quickly come to an end, Mr. Speaker. The legislation that the Premier has brought forward up to this point is inadequate. Nova Scotians want strong, real action to give all officials involved the ability to intervene and prevent bullying from happening when they see it, not just to count it and study it as the Premier's bill has done. They want more, Mr. Speaker. This House of Assembly, at this time, this spring, is in session. Will he bring forward appropriate, strong, protective legislation this spring and pass it in the same speed that the Government of Canada is moving on to protect people at the national level?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I already indicated, we intend to bring forward additional legislation in case there is any doubt that needs to be clarified. But, of course, as you would know, Mr. Speaker, the passage of any bill through this House and the speed with which that can happen is actually dependent on the cooperation of the opposition.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Minister of Justice about why our justice system failed the victims of abuse in the Fenwick-McIntosh case and why it failed all Nova Scotians. I asked the Minister if he would order an independent inquiry into these matters, and the Minister flatly refused. The Premier, based on his previous career, knows full well that something went horribly wrong in the administration of our justice system in the way this case has been handled. Since the Justice Minister is refusing to order an independent inquiry into the events around the McIntosh case, will the Premier of Nova Scotia reconsider his minister's misguided refusal and order an independent investigation into this matter?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'll just correct the member for Richmond. The minister did not refuse. In fact, he pointed out, I believe, to the House that there is already an internal review that is underway. I understand today in Ottawa, one of the colleagues of the member for Richmond actually asked for a federal inquiry into this matter, and for good reason, Mr. Speaker, because it appears that over the period that this thing was under consideration, this case was under consideration, there was some 14 years where twice the federal government, through their officials, went ahead and issued passports to Mr. McIntosh, despite the fact that there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest. So this, of course, warrants investigation. This is not something, of course, that happened during our time in government. In fact, federally, I believe the Liberals were in power. Indeed, provincially, during some of that time, the Liberals would have been in power. You know, like a lot of other things, you know, we have inherited. We have inherited, you know, these issues, and I want to assure the member that if an inquiry takes place, it should be led by the federal government, and if it is, of course, we would participate.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows, and I've acknowledged already, that the federal government has a role in this. There's no question. But the investigation started in Nova Scotia. And the question is, why did investigators in Nova Scotia take so long and not push this matter further? Second, once Mr. McIntosh finally arrived back in the country, it took the Public Prosecution Service of Nova Scotia, and the Premier, being a lawyer, knows that right away there was concerns with the delays, that he was going to argue that this wasn't brought in a timely manner. It took 3 full years for the Public Prosecution Service to even walk through the doors of a courtroom with this case. That is clearly unacceptable, and it calls out for answers as to what went wrong in that matter. So rather than make these victims wait any longer, even if it was not this government that was in power when this happened, will it not show leadership on behalf of the victims and on behalf of all Nova Scotians and order an independent investigation as to what went wrong in Nova Scotia regarding the Fenwick-McIntosh case?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't actually disagree with much of what the leader or the member for. I was giving him a promotion. The member for Richmond. The member for Richmond has said the Fenwick-McIntosh case is a deeply disturbing case, and why it is that it took as long as it took to get to where it should have, regardless of whether or not the prosecution service was issuing warrants for arrest and all of the other things it's done, I believe does need to be reviewed. There is an internal review going on now. We know that there is a federal responsibility with respect to this. I want to see the end of the internal review. If that does not produce the appropriate results where we can understand what happened, then I am certainly open to a further independent review. I would like to see one that would also take into account the delays that took place or the actions that took place on behalf of the federal government as well. It would be my desire that if this matter is going to be looked at, that it's looked at comprehensively, that of course the questions associated with the prosecution service here in Nova Scotia are looked at, but surely to goodness, we also have to look at what happened that led to these delays from the federal perspective as well.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Again, Mr. Speaker, there's no one else that would like to see that than myself, that both levels would be looked at the same time. I don't think anyone's advocating to have two separate independent inquiries take place. It would be the preference that there be one. But unfortunately, we have a division of powers at play here. And what the federal government will do is outside of our control here in this legislature. But we know what our province can do. These victims have waited long enough, Mr. Premier. You recognize that. Why it took 3 years for the Public Prosecution Service to even get this to court once he was here has to be answered. The victims deserve no less. We asked in December of 2011, when the Court of Appeal threw out these charges, for the minister to undertake a review. He refused. So here we are waiting again. If the Premier is not prepared to call a full independent inquiry now, will he at least today publicly commit to disclose the findings of the review taking place in the Public Prosecution Service?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly willing to take advice with respect to releasing information of the review. I would want to know whether or not there are any legal impediments to that, but I'm certainly prepared to consider it. Further, I want to inform the member for Richmond that today in Ottawa, the Minister of Justice is meeting with his federal counterpart, and he is requesting of his federal counterpart a full inquiry into this matter.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a few moments ago, the Premier said that what Cape Breton really needs is private investment and more jobs. That's true, Mr. Speaker, and now he has his chance, because Sydney is in the running for an $800 million iron ore pellet plant, which comes with 700 good private sector, well-paying jobs, Mr. Speaker, but they're competing with Sept-Îles, Quebec for those same jobs. Sydney has a lot going for it. It has a better workforce, has a better port. It's got a better location on our planet for trade and for the bringing in of supplies and materials. But because of this government, Mr. Speaker, Sydney has one other thing to consider, and that is that they pay the highest power rates in all of Canada, something that is important to actually attracting good jobs, Mr. Speaker. Sydney is being forced to compete with one hand tied behind their backs, the highest power rates in all of Canada. So will the Premier, in the interest of attracting those jobs that he talks about, agree to rip up his expensive power plan, freeze power rates, and help get Cape Breton attract the jobs that he says he wants them to have?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I'm not the only one who can't believe the audacity of the leader of the Conservative Party, the party that created the power rates of today, the party that privatized Nova Scotia Power, the party that tied us to expensive fossil fuel-driven electricity. Mr. Speaker, if anything, the leader of the Conservative Party, the next time he stands up, should apologize to Nova Scotians for forcing communities to compete with one hand tied behind their back.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Speaker, I want every Nova Scotian to look at their power bill this month, because they will see it is orange, and the reason it is orange is because today's power prices are all the responsibility of the current government and the current Premier. That's what Cape Breton is up against, Mr. Speaker. 1,800 jobs lost under this government since they came in, Mr. Speaker. But what we don't know, on top of those jobs that are lost, is how many are not coming here at all, because places like Sydney are competing with one hand tied behind their back for new jobs and investments. So will the Premier who watches and receives those orange power bills every month coming from Nova Scotia, will he freeze power rates and give Sydney a chance to win those jobs?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when they look at their power bills, what they see is a reflection of 10 years of mismanagement of this by the Conservative government, and then an additional 7 years of mismanagement by the previous Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. You know, finally, the people of Nova Scotia have a government that understand energy policy, understand that in order to have stable long-term rates, we have to get off of fossil fuels, that we have to move to renewables that will provide us with good long-term stable rates for business, something that they can depend on. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I would go so far as to say, no doubt, one of the advantages that companies like IBG are looking forward to would be the establishment of the Maritime Link and its ability to be able to get access to power, which incidentally will come ashore in Cape Breton.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when our power rates have gone up 30% in 4 years, when they are 15% above the national average and now the highest in Canada, when the unemployment rate in Cape Breton Island is 18.5%, and when 18,000 Nova Scotians moved away last year, the mismanagement is his and his government's and nobody else's. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. Now they have a chance for 700 jobs, real, good, private, good-paying, long-term jobs. Will the Premier freeze power rates and give Cape Breton and Sydney a chance to win those jobs?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia created the economic despair that we see in Nova Scotia today. It has been difficult, Mr. Speaker, to get past the $1.4 billion deficit that they left behind. It has been difficult, Mr. Speaker, to get past the pathetic record that they had with respect to economic development, the worst in the country year after year after year, Mr. Speaker. But here, Mr. Speaker, is a government that is turning the corner to a brighter future for Nova Scotians. And as to power rates, Mr. Speaker, what I want the Leader of the Conservative Party to know is this. We're not going to freeze power rates. We put power rates down 10% when we took the when we took the HST off of home electricity, something that the Conservative Party voted against.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago this month, the Premier made a commitment to the families of autistic children from one end of the province to the other. Premier committed to doubling funding for EIBI from its 2005-06 level of $4 million to $8 million, so that, in the words of the Premier, children living with autism should have access to the best treatment as early as possible to give them the best chance for success now and in the future. Mr. Speaker, I will table the Premier's speech. In 2011-12, funding increased for EIBI by $2 million, and a funding amount of $6 million remained unchanged in last year's budget. Last evening, the Minister of Health and Wellness confirmed funding for the 2013-14 year now stands at $4.1 million. Could the Premier please explain why he has failed to double the EIBI budget like he promised families and children he would do back in 2011?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the fact that instead of leaving what was in place where EIBI funding meant that there was simply a lottery where some kids got access to the services that they needed and others did not, we are committed to ensuring that all children get access to these services. That's what the budget does, Mr. Speaker. In addition to EIBI, we of course put in place a range of other supports that also support children on the autism spectrum. We're very proud of this, Mr. Speaker. I believe that parents are very happy with this. There's always more to do. And of course, we intend to do more. But we have, under very difficult circumstances, kept our commitments and ensured that children today get the services that they need.
The Honourable Member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier and this government made a commitment to children with autism and their families before the end of their mandate, and they have broken this promise. Mr. Speaker, the Premier indicated 2 years ago that every preschool child in Nova Scotia who needs the EIBI program for more than 1 year would get it. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, this government's agenda is such that if we slow down assessments, we can cut the treatment budget. Could the Premier explain how every preschool child in Nova Scotia who needs EIBI treatment will be able to get it when funding has been cut to 2005-2006 levels?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's pathetic to have a member of this House stand up and actively try and mislead people in the province. You know, it is pathetic when parents who are dealing with questions associated with the health of their children are actively misled by a member of the legislature, Mr. Speaker. The budget for EIBI was $2 million. It's now $4 million, and we are ensuring that children who are on the autism spectrum are getting the support they need.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that this Premier did not keep the promise which said the EIBI program would move from $4 million to $8 million. It's right in the speech that I just tabled. That's exactly what was said. 2 years ago, this Premier made a grand announcement about EIBI support, and he has broken his word. He spoke about the unfairness of the lottery system for EIBI and how his government was going to fix it once and for all so no family would be denied. This Premier not only failed to fulfill his full commitment of doubling the EIBI budget to a full $8 million. He has cut the budget back to the 2005-06 level of $4 million. Mr. Speaker, obviously the Premier likes the flash of announcements, but when he thinks everyone's backs are turned, he decides it would be acceptable to balance the budget on the backs of autistic children and their families in this province. Mr. Speaker, the reality is children will wait from 2.5, 3 years after being diagnosed until they're 4 years old, get a little bit of help, not the entire EIBI program. If $4 million was insufficient to this government in 2011, why is it now all of a sudden adequate in 2013?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, there are days in this House where I can't believe that a member of the House would try and prey on the parents of children who need services, Mr. Speaker. The reality is we made commitments. We made commitments to people which we stand by, which we keep. We ensure that the kids who need these services get them. Mr. Speaker, they have in their caucus a Minister of Health who, with respect to this, did absolutely nothing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are ensuring that there are appropriate services in place. We are living up to the commitments we made to those parents and to those kids, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, that caucus brought forward, Mr. Speaker, that caucus brought forward for us recommendations, for example, with respect to insulin pumps for kids, and then, Mr. Speaker, broke that commitment by voting against the very budget that implemented it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to you is for the Deputy Premier. We learned last week that unemployment in Cape Breton had soared to 18.6%, and I'll table the document to back that up. Statistics Canada shows that provincially, we have an unemployment to job ratio of 15:1, and I'll table that document. So, Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that with such high unemployment in Cape Breton, that the ratio at home would be much higher than the provincial average. So my question to the minister is, will the minister admit that their economic plan has been an absolute disaster for the people of Cape Breton?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell that member what's been a disaster, Mr. Speaker. The taking of the Service Canada jobs, Mr. Speaker. Taking out services for veterans, that's a disaster. Mail service in North Sydney, that's a disaster, Mr. Speaker. That's who ruined our economy. Is that party over there, and they love their federal brothers that are doing it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised. All along I thought we were in the House of Assembly, not in the